one thing that our team really wanted to focus on in this year's festival was the lived experience. You know, we're planners, we're architects, we're designers, and we deal with these abstract concepts, you know, globalism, regionalism, capitalism all the time. But we were really interested in interrogating what the actual experience of human beings in these huge systems are. And so, being the child of immigrants myself, diaspora is something that I think about a lot, what it means to hold that identity, to try and make a difference, to make sense of oneself and one's purpose in the world, given that I come from this really complicated background and exist in this really complicated place. So I thought maybe that's where we could start this evening's discussion. Something that came up for us was the emotional and personal costs of separation. You know, people are being displaced around the globe, not necessarily of their own volition, but because they're being pushed around by these tidal forces. And so, Jethro, maybe I'll address the first point to you. You mentioned that The Children of Spring, which was the last film that we saw of the Syrian and Kurdish refugees trying to get from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, was like your own experience except fast-forwarded. So do you want to share a little bit about what that meant for you and how it resonated?
Yeah, I feel like that film really reflects every immigrant's experience of coming from one country to another. But I feel like it's a fast-track version, especially of what me and my family has gone through. You know, trying to get in the boat, not being able to get into the boat. It's like trying to get a visa and, you know, being separated from your family because of the immigration rules. So I feel like that represents every immigrant's experience. And of course, you know, being able to come here and, you know, having to face the assimilation, you know, part of it is also difficult. So yeah, that's how I felt about that particular piece.
And your own personal story, the reason that your family, your mother, elected to leave was also pretty had its own intensity. Your own personal story. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what the forces were, the political forces that drove your family to have to emigrate?
Yeah, my mother was a political activist in the Philippines, and it was during the time of the Marcos regime. And she decided to leave the Philippines because the main reason was she didn't want to be murdered in front of her children. So she decided to leave and immediately petitioned all of us, and all of my siblings were able to come here, except for me. I was left behind, and I had to wait almost 20 years just to get here. So yeah, and when I got here, I decided to film our encounter, and I made it into a film. I sat down with her and I confronted her about my feelings of abandonment as a child. And yeah, the film is called My Revolutionary Mother. You can find it on Amazon.
That's really touching, and that's one thing that at the film festival we recognize as part of the unique power of this medium, right? To convey feeling and emotion, and in a really lyrical way, as we saw, I think, with these three films, capture an experience. I really loved how, in particular, the last one was kind of an assemblage of different types of footage, and it was, you know, really challenging the way that we sort of recount our memories and we capture them and we put them on display, and expose our vulnerabilities. So thank you for being vulnerable with us tonight.
Definitely.
So there was a political reason that your own family had to decided to move, and Kathleen, that's a lot of what you study and you research and you write about are these big global systems, whether they're militaristic, political, economic, that are driving people to move around. They're driving human trafficking, dynamics of human trafficking around the globe. And we were talking a lot about, also in the Filipino context, although not exclusively this, the reality of remittances, and that for a lot of people, a lot of the immigrant experience is about having to leave one's place of origin in order to work someplace else and then send that money back home. And for the Philippines, that's a pretty significant part of actually our national GDP. Our overseas workers. And so you've also studied the experiences of women in South and Central America. And yeah, we were just talking a lot about global forces and how that impacts the experience of families. And
yeah, I mean, for me, as someone who doesn't study film and also doesn't study the specific parts of the world that these films are talking about, it was really powerful both to consider the commonalities and then the really significant distinctions and specificities of these different experiences, right? So I don't want to gloss Syrian refugees, Philippine overseas workers, Nepalese children, right? But just as you said, I mean, what's powerful is the ways in which global political economy shapes people's capacity and the right to migrate, the conditions of migration, and then the conditions of non-migration, right? For folks that the right to migrate and the right to not migrate is something that people in Central America talk about, right? That we don't want to have to migrate, but there's these powerful forces that are constraining our options, forcing us to migrate, and what's framed as a choice is when we frame migration in terms of a choice, we are obscuring these really violent and also very diverse situations that frame these, human movement, right? So you think about there's 65 million displaced people in the world today, right? So who is included in that? I don't even think actually that the Philippines overseas Filipino workers, what? The OFW category, right? I don't think that actually gets counted even in the $65 million displaced people, because they're not counted. They're considered contract workers, right? They're voluntary economic migrants. In fact, they're sponsored by the Philippine state, who is, facilitating that, right? In the Philippines, you don't go to the unemployment office; you go to the overseas work office. So, that said, and I think what number is 7% of the GDP of the Philippines is remittances. At what point is it? At what point are we talking about crises, migrant crises? You talk about the European migrant crisis since the 2015. People talk about the European migrant crisis. This is not a crisis anymore when it's structured into the fundamental, economic organization of states, of global geopolitical relationships. It's part and parcel of a system that's dependent on the free flow of capital and the unfree movement of labor, right? So I think about the Ashmina story as what does it take to survive? There's a lot of Nepalese migrants in the United States, right? I don't know if there's any Nepalese.
We have one right here, who actually is a friend of mine.
Thank you. Hello.
Flash.
Right? So I'm right? More maybe in the East Coast than California? Both? Well, everywhere. Okay. See, there you go. You landed where? Mississippi. All right. Okay. Thank you. Well, I want to hear what you thought about the film. Yeah. Yeah, because it wasn't made by Nepalese. I mean, that's also what's interesting about it, in contrast to the other two films also, right? It was somebody who went there paragliding, apparently. The filmmaker visited as a paraglider and then became interested in this phenomenon and really wanted to work with local people to make the film. But what are Ashmina's options, right? That's kind of the question at the end of the film. They're provoking it. Where is she going? Where is she walking to? What's her future? Yeah, yeah.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I just, that what you said about framing it as a choice really struck me because, yeah, you're so right about that. This is such a huge part of the Filipino culture now, of families being separated because they actually have no choice. They have to go abroad in order to provide for their family. And in fact, I was just there last week, and all the conversations, not all, but a lot of the conversations really surround about these topics, about how they were treated abroad. All of my classmates, not all, but most of my classmates are actually occupied abroad, elementary, high school, you name it. And they come home with all these stories of abuse and discrimination that they had to experience, of them going back to their families and their kids not recognizing them anymore, those stuff.
Yeah. And thank you for calling out that it isn't a choice. It isn't a calculus of choice. That's definitely a word that I used early in the evening, and I appreciate us sort of being provoked around that. Another thing that the Ashmina film made me meditate deeply on, or the reading that I had of it, was a colonialist reading, right? And so, there are folks who are coming to maybe not extract resources, but to consume an experience, and to, rely on this, not necessarily informal, but certainly unstructured sort of labor economy, where young women like Ashmina are, have almost no choice but to participate in if they want to make a living, and that's forced. It's not. She's not electing to do that, right? And we see how that means that she is. That means she doesn't go to school, and so this tourism and sort of global tourism and the kind of the classism around that, for me, has a lot of colonialist resonances. And Jethro, you were talking about this as well, which just relates to the comment you made about, you were in the Philippines recently, and sort of what you observed about that experience and what you felt and how, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I was in Coron, named as one of the most beautiful islands in the Philippines. We had this island hopping tour, and we had this tour guide who was really funny, and he took really good care of us. And by the time lunchtime, all of the tourists will sort of come to a place where there's a buffet, and we were all eating, and I saw him on the side, and he was not eating with us. So I asked him, why are you not eating with us? And he's like, oh, I'm fine, later. And then when we were all done, I saw him and all the other tour guides eating from what was left over of what the tourists were eating. So that really struck me again. And you could immediately see the power dynamics of the tourists and the servers in these localities. And I think we really should rethink tourism in that sense. I think it's worth mentioning that there's a tour in the Philippines right now called Tao Pilipinas. It's an island tour as well. But what happens is they've made it in such a way that it's a communion with the locals and the sailors. So there's not a separation between the locals and the tourists themselves. So I thought that was imaginative of the tourist experience. And I think if we can imagine tourism like that, it would take precedent on so many other things as well that could be possible in those areas.
Yeah, Kathleen, you were talking about, or had been talking about, the ways in which there are communities in Central and South America, sort of recognizing that tourism and ecotourism could be structured in a way that actually, benefits the people in place and accrue value to them. And I think that's a really it's not necessarily anything new, but it's an interesting counterpoint to kind of kind of the larger dynamic. Anytime I'm in Thailand or anywhere else in Southeast Asia, the power dynamic is really triggering for me as a brown person, an Asian brown person. But yeah, I wonder if we could, talk a little bit about some of these case studies or examples of how that's working, or how that's come about and what that means to people.
Well, I think precisely because of what you mentioned, sort of the persistence of colonial economic and cultural relationships, right? And social structures. It's pretty difficult to do socially just, unproblematic tourism, right? But the example that I gave was just one that was striking to me, and I'm not sure it's an example of a success. But when a couple years ago, I was in Highland, Guatemala, visiting a community that was made up largely of people who had been deported from Postville, Iowa, in one of the first large mass raids that was done at a meatpacking plant there. So hundreds of people had to return to this town. And they were really struggling. The town had been dependent on their income, right, their remittances, and they were struggling to find a way to not only to survive, but sort of to sustain the town in the face of the reality that migration was no longer going to be possible, right? And what they had done was they observed that they had a national park nearby, and that some North American and European tourists were starting to come there. And so they were going to try to set up a cooperative tour, eco tour, mountain guide, sort of thinking about how Sherpas had sort of created an industry to get to both provide income and then, and also kind of, I think they had a little bit of an educational project, right? To let these folks coming from the global north understand what conditions they were facing as they tried to sustain themselves as deportees in an economy that was not going to ever be able to provide them opportunities to sustain their families, really, right? So for me, it was it was an interesting example, and we had talked about that too, was that all of the films sort of, while the emphasis on pathos and really, tremendous human suffering and tragedy, there's also this amazing power that comes across of people also responding to their conditions and with a tremendous amount of agency, right? That was what was really something. It's amazing to me to even think about the production of the film, the one in Berlin, the final film, from the point of view of Syrian refugees reenacting sort of their Mediterranean crossing. And it also reminded me of the new documentary for Sama. Has anyone seen that? Yeah, right? And that, which is also a self, I want to say her name, Wad Al-Khatib. And she films for years during the occupation of Aleppo, her family story. And sort of just this, and she, after they eventually are forced to leave, they don't want to leave, right? They're part of the Syrian resistance. They're fighting their right. They're fighting their, one of the last to flee. And sort of this idea of the film, and I was actually, it's great to be here with Jethro as a filmmaker to think about film as this potential powerful option for conveying these stories to new audiences.
Well, maybe one more point, and then we can open it up to the audience for discussion. The first film, rather the middle film, sorry, Letter to the Outsider, which was a woman reading the letter of someone who had been imprisoned. Some of the words that I noted were, I lose my language to think. I'm in a huge box with smaller boxes inside. And that made me think of what certainly I know my parents and my grandparents' experience was moving, and kind of the language and the cultural barrier, and that being, on top of the trauma of having to leave someplace, the whole process of and experience of assimilation, and learning a new, cultural touchstones and language, and all of the things that come with trying to integrate and be part of and be productive and happy in a new place. And so, Jethro, I remember this is something that really struck you as well, either both from a personal place, but then also just artistically, the way that particular film was put together and presented. And I wonder if you...
Yeah, definitely. I was watching that film, I thought this is so close to my immigrant experience, of trying to assimilate. I feel like if you're an immigrant, you're almost always like a prisoner because you're in a new country. You don't know the language. You can't express yourself readily to people because, there's a lot of barriers, cultural barriers and whatnot. So that really resonated with me. And then as I was watching it again, I was thinking, what would have it been like for my parents who, probably had more difficult times as they were assimilating, especially for my mother who drastically changed her environment from, organizing people to coming here and tending to older folks that, that were here and trying to take care of them and, being in that silence of a room and not being able to speak with anyone. So I could just imagine the kind of psychological imprisonment that she had to go through. It must have been so difficult. And I think a lot of immigrants can relate to this. Yeah.
And those themes are very much things that FaCine, the International Filipino Cine Festival, treats. And so when is the next FaCine season? What month are we looking at?
I think that our
Neil?
Neil should be our...
Sometime this year, sometime in 2020? Yeah. October 2020. Okay, so
our chairman is Neil Torrefield, by the way.
Hi, Neil.
FaCine.
So we'll of course be cross-promoting FaCine when the time comes. So you'll all hear about the next season of offerings at the International Filipino Cine Festival. All right, so I'm gonna get up and start handing around the mic, and I saw a lot of people nodding and very enthusiastic to get in. Could you tell us your name? Okay.
Hello, hi, my name is Genesis. Hello. So I have a question for all three of you, or a question for any of you. I know who organized this was a bunch of urban planners and architects. Now, what I noticed in the first film where she got her first taste of capitalism, right? She gave into the short-term gain of being able to purchase that through tourism, right? But her entire city was built around catering to the tourist. And therefore, when she was trying to get money from a person that should be her own kind, there was a questioning of her stealing. So my question to you is this: when we build cities, it's easy for us to fall into building the city for pure capitalistic gain, right? Building a bunch of small businesses. How is it that we design cities where our focus is on the people that live there, and we're experiencing this in San Francisco, with the people that live there as being first and designing around them? What different policies are in place as urban designers?
All right, so we're getting super deep off top. I like that. I certainly have thoughts as one of the urban planners in the room, but
Go for it.
does it? Okay. This actually was a huge topic of conversation at Spur yesterday, or I think it was the day before, when we were thinking about what particularly at the municipal scale, we can really achieve and we can really do, recognizing that these forces are global, right? These are global forces of capitalism that are washing over places, and you see that manifest in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, Kuala Lumpur. We have, in the San Francisco context, had a very strong reaction and response, an anti-growth response, right? We didn't want to Manhattanize our city. So I think in a way, we've seen that, what you describe in the way that San Francisco has handled its land use regulation. That has, that sort of era of extreme kind of preservation, no growth, is something that has shifted in the last 20 years. We're seeing a lot more in development and growth, but we're still in crisis in terms of what it means to be a place, in terms of what it means to have intact culture and integrity and integration around different strata, classes of society. I'm actually going to turn this over to Ron, because he moderated the panel the other day at Spur, where we treated this very subject, right, Ron? I mean, okay, so some thoughts from our humanities advisor on this really germane question.
So the Urban Film Fest is interested in urban planning, but we're also connecting people who have an interest in the law and in finance and in political philosophy or political theory, and just living in the city, right? This is not, the funnel isn't just to urban planning, but really goes from big to all of us. So the question you ask is extremely important, right? So how do we build cities for people that serve them? And maybe we need to not think about how do we build cities so we can have better businesses? How do we can have cities so that we can have more fun? But rather, how do we build cities? How do we create communities so that justice is delivered? So that we can really recognize and appreciate, right, the basic fundamental moral equality of everybody, right? So that they have a chance to flourish and thrive. Ashmina did not have a chance to flourish and thrive. Her flourishing was being squashed by the tourists who refused to give her a few extra dollars because of the transfer rate, right? You don't want to give too much because you're in Nepal or you're in Guatemala and you can't afford an extra $20, right? so instead of doing that, instead of thinking about designing for this or for that, how about we design for people and we design for allowing them to really have a flourishing life. So you just asked well, the mic was passed to me. I'm not an urban planner, I'm a philosopher, and the thing that I'm most concerned with is, right, your and mine and all of our basic dignity and how our societies is satisfying that basic dignity or failing because we're being crushed by both the tourist or the economy or even, in her case, her own family, right? So that's my answer.
All right. I was in.
Are there any initiatives that you know that are out there that are in flight that are addressing this problem?
We actually also screened a film on Barcelona recently, and the new mayor who came into power, actually she was reelected, and I would say we could look to Barcelona in terms of what it means to be a city that is heavily touristed, that has a lot of cultural cachet that people want to come and experience and consume, and the way that Barcelona has regulated, for example, around short-term rentals and Airbnb and other platforms that have emerged to facilitate the extraction of capital. So I would look to Barcelona. I think I don't think we have enough time to talk about San Francisco. We could all grab beers later if anybody's down for that. Hit me up at the checkout table later. So we had a question here and then one in the back.
I actually just had a comment on that last one. Thank you for. Oh, no. Thank you for the question and thank you for the responses. I feel like when we frame it even as like, how do we design cities for communities, there is an inherent power dynamic too, as if people aren't designing cities for themselves and for their community. And I wanted to appreciate the panelists as well for pointing out that communities already have that resilience built in, and it's important to recognize where communities are already building for themselves and those networks, whether they're in Guatemala or in neighborhoods in San Francisco. So.
Thank you. Snaps. So I heard some snaps. Okay, so we had a question, but this is like the power row right here.
Thank you. And thank everybody that's put this together. My question is sort of a corollary to the last one, and is not so much about how do we build the cities, but how do we decide who gets to live in them? And that the third film, I think, struck me a lot, thinking about a lot of the politics, the dynamics around, where do the Syrian or the Kurdish or the Guatemalan or the Filipino refugees end up, and what hierarchy we put them in. In some cases, refugees are political, or they're fleeing explicit violence, or maybe they're economic refugees. And something that's always struck me is during the peak of the European migrant crisis, there was a question of who has to take the refugees. Is it the Greeks? Is it the Turks because they're the closest and they're also Muslim? Or should it be the Germans because they're the wealthiest? And through the third film, we saw, they ended up in Greece and then Turkey, and then they eventually ended up in Germany. And a question of, oh, yes, you're an economic refugee or migrant, but do you have to go all the way to Germany? Do you deserve to go all the way to Germany? And in San Francisco, we're always talking about who gets to live in the city, who gets to live in the peninsula or the East Bay or all the way out and, like as far as the Central Valley. And so it's sort of a question, I maybe not a period at the end of the sentence, but to say that, what are the thoughts of the panel about, the sense of place and how we decide who gets to be where?
Any reactions, responses? Really great question.
Yes, I do. I mean, yeah, that's great. For me, that's something that troubles me every single day. I'm born and raised here in San Francisco, 4th generation. Why am I the only one left in my extended family? Someone else in the same boat, right? And thinking in terms of when we talk a lot about San Francisco as a sanctuary city, and who do we consider part of our sanctuary family, right? It's unclear that we struggle to abide by our commitments to sanctuary for refugees, and we also utterly fail in our commitments to all of our neighbors, right? When we have over 1,000 people on the daily waiting list for emergency shelter bed in San Francisco, when we have hundreds of families, right? We say that there's no family waiting list. There are families waiting for emergency shelter, not even permanent homes in San Francisco. So clearly to me, who has a right to live here right now is people that have the money to pay, right? And somehow that's become naturalized into the logic of gentrification and displacement to the point that people say, well, the cities are just expensive now. And the cost to all of us of that is so incalculable. And the cost to our future, our political and cultural future here in San Francisco, of all of the people that are being pushed out and not being allowed to come, and then the conditions in which people struggle to stay. For me, it's something I worry about every day, and I also don't have a neat bow on it or period on the end of the sentence at all. Yeah, I don't know what you want to say about this.
I resonate everything that you said, but something about the question also sparked something in me. I just felt that, not to mellow down the issues here in San Francisco, but to me that question is sort of like a privilege question too. Because if you think about the opposite, the flip side of that is that all these multinational companies and tech companies are out there in my country operating, sometimes with tax exemptions. So I think a valid question would also be, is there even planning over there in the Philippines where they're taking advantage of the labor, So I think this problem is really vast, and there's a lot of things to discuss about it.
And yet it's connected, right?
Yeah.
Because for me, because I'm also thinking about the tens of thousands of, right now, Central American and Mexican refugees and migrants that are stuck trying to get here. And many are trying to come to the Bay Area because this is where family is, and this is where family has been for generations. We're a region that there are Central Americans that were brought here during the gold rush. This is a long-standing relationship. Mexicans, obviously, it was Mexican territory until very shortly, 70 years ago. So I think for me also, it's not just a question of who's being displaced in the city, but who's being prevented from even arriving here, and the pain and suffering that's causing to people that are here. Whether it's folks who are trying to be reunited with their families due to the Muslim ban, the ever-expanding Muslim ban, right? There's many, many families here that are trying to bring their family back. There are students that are trying to get back here to study. And there's more than 5,000 refugees in tents on the Mexican-U.S. border. And there would be more, except that we've enlisted the Mexican state at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars a year in people, personnel, and cash, to turn the whole country into a border zone. So there's thousands, just last week, 4,000 Central Americans were pushed back with violent military force in the southern border of Mexico. So for me, there's also this other question of who's even allowed to reunite with their people. Not all of those people are obviously coming to the Bay Area, but there's people around us suffering because their families are trying to reunite, as you were talking about, the decades. This is a Filipino-American story, decades workers here struggling with family, working here for 20, 25 years with their immediate family on a waiting list for a visa to reunite with them. I'm thinking of domestic workers who are now in their 70s themselves, taking care of people even older than themselves because their children, their adult children, aren't allowed to come to be with them, to take care of them so that they can finally retire, right? Yep. So,
yeah. Definitely, and that is my personal experience. When I was separated, I tried to apply for a visa 4 times. And my main reason was just to really be with my family, and I got denied 4 times. And every time I was denied, I felt like I died in each time. And I questioned, like, what did I do to deserve, such a tragic story? I just want to be with my family, and why is that illegal? Yeah. And I think that resonates with a lot of immigrants.
Yeah, I think scale is something too that has come up a lot in the festival so far. The city scale, the region, nations, and what does it mean to attack these human problems, these social issues, when we're not thinking integratedly, sort of across jurisdictions and across different regions of the world. So we'll take one more question, and then we can close this off.
Okay, good discussion. Thank you all. I happen to be a Greek immigrant, and my family, they were immigrants, they were refugees from Turkey. So ironically, most of the population of Greece is, they're part of the Greek diaspora, and they were all ethnically cleansed, so they were all returned back to Greece. So it's just a funny, ironic fact, and the Greeks are very sympathetic to the refugee crisis. But Greece has never been an immigrant destination. It's always been, quasi third world, and that's really overwhelming. So it's just a funny observation.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming this evening and sticking around.